What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we're taking a look at my current rest of season rankings, talking about the players who have risen the most over the last 2 weeks. You can always see my exact rankings where I have every player ranked amongst all positions by just looking at them at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. And the rankings are now updated to be a trade calculator as well, so you can get the most value as possible out of your trades. So we'll go over the biggest risers in a second, but first, of course, have to start things off as usual, the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was Robbie Anderson has the league's worst catch rate, which non-rookie ranks second behind him with a minimum of 30 targets. The answer, of course, is Odell Beckham Jr. Joseph Goodyear was the first to get that right on YouTube. He's closing in on making it to the Hall of Fame for YouTube. And that at Birch1982 is the first to get that right on Twitter. Today's stat, through Sunday, so not including the Monday night game, although no one's going to get there, I don't think, in the Monday night game. But through Sunday, only 4 running backs have at least 100 carries and at least 25 receptions this season. Alvin Kamara, Najee Harris, Aaron Jones, and what other running back? Who is fourth? All right, so as always, starting off with tight ends and quarterbacks. 2 movers for tight ends. We've got Dan Arnold and Pat Freiermuth. Arnold has seen now 23 targets over the last 2 weeks. He's played 73%, 62%, 72% of the snaps. Meanwhile, Freiermuth, if I'm saying his name wrong, I apologize. Like Freiermuth, I don't know. But the rookie for the Steelers, however you exactly pronounce it, I think I'm doing it right, but who really knows? He has exactly 7 targets back-to-back weeks. His stock is way up because Juju goes down for the season, Ebron gets injured, and so now he's thrusted into that full-time role, tight end role, but then also he's getting these underneath looks. It's something we talked about, I believe, a few weeks ago when Juju went down about the people who are going to gain value. It's not necessarily that he's taking over all the snaps from Ebron, because Ebron wasn't really doing anything. It's that they've lost some of this underneath targets, and of course, Big Ben can't throw the ball very far, and so if he's going to keep picking a lot of those up while also being a really high-end prospect, a person that they obviously want to be the tight end of the future for them. This isn't some scrub they picked up. This isn't some nobody that's just happened to be getting a few targets. This is a very high-end receiving prospect that they want to be their tight end going forward. So when we see players like that increase in snaps, increase in targets, and it all makes sense, we look into that, right? And so he's going to be a high-end tight end too. I just want to note that the top 12 for tight end is fairly locked in. We kind of know who those guys are. They're not going to fall out of the top 12. We know the tight end ones, unless they get hurt, they're not kind of changing. And so Pat and Dan, they can only go up so high because Dan Arnold obviously getting these targets, but we don't know how consistent they're going to be because they have Marvin Jones, they have LaVisca, and they're not that fantastic of an offense, but he's gained value because after that top 10 or 12 for tight end, it's a cliff. Everyone else, it's are you getting any sort of looks on any decent offense? You're ranked really high. And so still, these guys aren't people that it's yes, I'm super pumped to rely on in my 12-team league, but they're people who we should definitely be looking at because they could start spiking later in the season. At quarterback, we've got 2 big movers. Not even that big, just 2 movers worth noting. Russell Wilson and Carson Wentz. Wentz for the same reason, or Wilson for the same reason as before. I talked about when he got hurt. Every single week he's going to slowly move up a little bit before he comes back. I believe week 9 they're going on bye, and then week 10 he can return. We don't know right now. We're probably not going to know until very late. It could be a similar situation to Dak this last week where he's practicing in pregame warmups. We don't know until right before the game in week 10. But it's possible that he does return out of their week 9 bye and plays in week 10. And of course, his value in fantasy is going way up then. And especially, they don't have a great record right now. They're in a brutal division, but they're still in the playoff hunt. The NFC is super top heavy. And so you've got a ton of teams that are already locked into playoffs. How wild is that, in week 8? But a ton of teams locked in. And then a handful of teams that don't have good records but are vying for that wild card spot. And so Seattle's one of them. They pick up this win this last week, basically keeps them in it. they need Wilson back. And so as soon as he's able to return, he's coming back. He's going to be a large part of the offense. And so, again, moving him up. And then Wentz has just looked really, really good. Of course, we're going to talk about Pittman later on. Pittman's breaking out. Okay, I want to reiterate. Carson Wentz does not look good from a football standpoint, right? Like, he is... Like he just makes such stupid decisions so many times that it's like he'll put together a really, really good drive and then completely miss someone that's wide open. Or throw in a triple coverage when someone on the other side of the field is just standing there like with their hands open. Like, did you guys see that play with Jonathan Taylor? It was the interception to end the game against the Titans. Jonathan Taylor is just wide open in the middle of the field. Easy 10 yards on the catch, probably gains 10 to 15 more yards. Huge play in overtime. Instead, he goes to like a triple covered Michael Pittman Jr. because he's just locked into him and he throws the pick and they lose the game. That is something that happens with Carson Wentz. So he's not a good NFL quarterback. But for fantasy, he's running it a little bit more now that he doesn't have like 2 sprained ankles. And he's throwing enough touchdowns, throwing for enough yardage where I think he should always be in our mind as a streaming option, not someone you're playing in a difficult matchup, not someone you're playing when we don't think they're going to throw the ball a ton. But for fantasy, he's someone we should definitely consider streaming. And again, it's the same thing as always with quarterback. If you're not inside the top 10, you're a streaming option. Like it's kind of irrelevant who moves for I don't know if I said tight end there, for the quarterback position. It doesn't matter what movement we see outside of that top 10 because everyone outside the top 10 is just who are they playing this week, who has a good matchup, who can I stream, and then it's the top 10 that you're like basically every week just starting those guys. That's it really for tight end quarterback. We'll move on to what really matters, and that's the running backs. As far as running back 1 movers, who was the top movers inside that top like 10 or 12, we've got Nick Chubb and Saquon Barkley. Both of them moved up 4 spots. Chubb up to running back 9, Barkley up to running back 12. One note on Barkley though, you guys are listening to this before the Monday night game. He's already been ruled out of that game, so it's not that I'm considering him playing there. But I'm recording this on Monday, of course, so I don't know any sort of news that might come out Monday night, might come out on Tuesday. I am not expecting him to play in week 9 just because they go on bye in week 10. And so it'd be kind of weird if they like forced him to come back early, like rushed him back, because obviously if he's not ready for this week, it's not a guarantee he's ready next week and not guaranteed he's 100%. So if he's not 100%, why would you rush him back when you go on bye the next week and risk another injury, suffering a setback and missing even more time? So to me, it makes all the sense in the world to hold him out in week 9, 100% healthy in week 11. But I moved him up just because how many running backs at this point are capable of 20 points per game? Not that many. And so he basically at this point has to be ranked as a low end 1 because as we continue to just knock off running backs and just have more and more get hurt, and especially now with Henry, you have fewer difference makers at the position. And so if we think he comes back and he scores 20 fantasy points per game starting in week 11, well, that's really, really valuable. And maybe you can survive until week 11 not having him. So that's kind of why I moved him up. And then, of course, Chubb moves up just because he's Nick Chubb. And when he's healthy and Hunt is out, he's an absolute stud. Yes, Ernest Johnson looked really good. But as we talked about last week, he's done that before. Like last season when they had the injuries, Johnson looked really good. Like he's just a good running back. It doesn't matter. Like Nick Chubb is probably at this point now with the Henry injury, the best pure running back in the NFL. And so they're going to use him. They're going to use him a ton. So he's going to be really good. I also just keep moving up Leonard Fournette every single week. He seems to move up like 1 or 2 spots every week. He's now up 2 more spots to the running back 13. I don't know how much higher he can get now that he's at 13, but he's almost a running back 1 at this point. And it's the exact same take as 2 weeks ago when I talked about moving him up from like the lower teams. It's just that, he's a feature back. They hate Ronald Jones. And while they'll use Bernard in 2-minute drill when they're trailing, how often are you in 2-minute drill in the NFL? I mean, there's only so many options for it, so many opportunities for it. And then the Bucs are good. And while they lost us last week, there are going to be very few games in the season that they're trailing and they're needing to use Bernard. So Fournette, whenever you find a feature running back on one of the best offenses in football, they're valuable. So he's very, very valuable this season. I've moved Elijah Mitchell up 7 spots to running back 19. We've been over for a few weeks now how they hate Trey Sermon. Like, they just do not like Trey Sermon. But with these injuries and his performance, like, we weren't always 100% sure. Like, given how high they drafted Trey Sermon, it was like, I know that Mitchell is, he was hurt, and then he's going to come back, and we were like, he's probably going to be the guy when he returns, but we weren't like 100% sure on that, just because, again, like I said, they spent a lot of draft capital on Trey Sermon. Maybe there was a chance that he's slower coming off injury, and they leaned towards Sermon. But when he came back, it was very, very clear Elijah Mitchell is the guy. And in every single week since, it's been very, very clear he's the guy. And so he's a running back 2 moving forward. I talked about it in the start-sit video last week. We are at the point where he's a must-start. So if you have him, he's in your starting lineup every single week. It's not as a 1, but it's a running back 2, a really good running back 2. I don't care what matchup it is. You're playing Elijah Mitchell in any sort of scoring format. I've also moved up Michael Carter. This was another running back I talked about in the start-sit video. I kind of wanted to see one more week. Because it's the Jets. I don't know what the Jets are going to do, especially when they had, the backup quarterback going in there and apparently being a god. But we didn't know for sure if they were going to go right back to a committee after 1 week. At this point, it's now clear that they're done with the committee. They're going to use Michael Carter. Dude has 17 receptions over the last 2 weeks. I think that I got a lot of heat I had him ranked pretty consistently in that, like, running back 28 to, 32 range for a large part of the beginning of the season, and the number one complaint was, where's the upside? He's on the Jets, right? And my response was always, if we can ever get a situation where, one, the Jets look like competent, like not even good, just they look competent on offense, and we can get Michael Carter used in like a 2-man committee, like, because they were using a 3-man committee, and that's basically impossible for anyone to be good in. But if they can use a 2-man committee, they can look competent on offense, he could be really good in fantasy, especially because he's so good in the receiving game. Well, that's now happening. At least this last week, they looked okay on offense. I didn't think that it would take a Zach Wilson injury for him to look okay. But he looks okay on offense now. And now he's getting receptions. And now they're using a 2-back committee. And he's been phenomenal. Was he the running back 1 in fantasy this last week? So now we're at the point where you can also start using Michael Carter pretty much every week as running back 2, especially in full PPR formats. And if he ever gets 80% of the snaps every single week, he's going to be matchup proof because that's how valuable receptions are in fantasy. Khalil Herbert is also up 12 spots to running back 27. I've talked about his breakout for a few weeks now, and honestly, like, I'm just not 100% sure where to ultimately rank him. So there's going to be another player later that we talk about how there's a little bit of variance to the ranking. I have him at 27. If I knew for the full season he was going to be the guy, he'd be right up there with like Elijah Mitchell. Right? But I don't really know what's going to happen when David Montgomery comes back. Montgomery's still likely a few weeks away, and so we should still get like a few games where Herbert is the featured back, right? Especially with Williams getting injured. Like, they're just so confident in Herbert, and he's looked so good that they are perfectly fine giving him, 80-90% of the touches, right? And that's featured back in the NFL. But what happens when Montgomery comes back? I tend to think that the organization likes him so much and he's been so good that at worst, it's going to be a split, whether that's 50-50, 45-55, like somewhere around half. I think that's worst case scenario for Herbert. And under that scenario, he would lose a lot of value. But since the team likes to run the ball so much, and since the state of running back behind this ranking, like into the 30s and 40s, is so bad, I think 27 is a really good spot for him. It captures a little bit of that upside, like, wow, he's still the feature back. And it also accounts for the risk that it's a committee on the Bears, and that's gross, right? But since we don't really know what's going to happen, I think 27 is a really good spot for him. He is not someone that I'd be like selling right now because, again, we also don't know exactly when Montgomery's going to come back. And every single week that you can have a featured back is super valuable for your chances of making the playoffs. We're still trying to make the playoffs in our leagues. And so I'm not trading Herbert. I just think he's really good, and you want to be hanging on to him. I've moved Myles Gaskin up 9 spots to running back 29. This comes after that Malcolm Brown injury. Malcolm Brown going on the short-term IR. I believe it's short-term IR. But regardless, Gaskin, he didn't have like a good game this last week, but they traveled to Buffalo. Like, we didn't expect him to have a good game. We wanted to see the volume be there. And then it was, right? 12 carries, 4 targets. He's now averaging 6 targets per game in the last month and getting 16 touches even in a game in Buffalo. Like, that's pretty solid, right? And so I'm buying into them giving him this sort of workload going forward. And when they're not playing such a difficult opponent, it's going to result in much better performances. And so I'd be pretty surprised if he wasn't featured as a buy low running back in this next week's video, because the volume was there, the production just wasn't. And whenever that happens, we're going to be buying these players. Mark Ingram also up 9 spots to running back 41 in his first game after being traded on Wednesday. Like, this never happens. When running backs are traded midweek, and they come in, they play 29% of the snaps. When Alvin Kamara is the starting quarterback, right? It wasn't like they had some scrub. Still given 6 carries, 2 targets. Obviously, that happened because he's familiar with the team. He spent a lot of time there. They know who he is. He knows the plays. It's not shocking that he played that much, but it just points to the upside, right? If he can go out there and get 30-35% of the snaps every week, he can be in that 8 to 10 touch range, sometimes getting goal line, still getting some targets. He's going to be valuable, but the real value comes from the potential value, right? He now joins guys like Tony Pollard, A.J. Dillon, Alexander Madison as just premier handcuffs. Guys that if the starter goes down, they're league winners, right? If Alvin Kamara were to get injured, that would hurt 2 of my 3 teams because I have him in 2 leagues. But Ingram would just be a slam dunk, right? He'd get so many looks, so much touchdown upside. And since that's baked in, you have to move him up in the rankings. He's definitely a valuable player to own, even if the short-term value while Kamara is healthy isn't that you're starting him, it's that potential value. That's why he has to be on rosters. After that, it was small movements, running backs that moved up, but it's up from 70 to 60, and it's sort of irrelevant. You can just look at the rest of the season rankings if you want to see those guys, but they were kind of irrelevant movements beyond what I talked about here. At wide receiver, the 2 biggest movers as far as wide receiver ones were concerned are J.Chase and A.J. Brown. Chase has Rookie of the Year on lock at this point. Basically, if he doesn't get hurt and miss a month, he's the Rookie of the Year, and there shouldn't even be a vote. It should be unanimous. I have him up 5 spots from the wide receiver 12 to wide receiver 7. I think it's worth noting that whole range of wide receiver 7 through 15, they're so close to each other. So I say he's moved up, and I've also said that A.J. Brown moved up, but that whole range of a mid 1 to a mid 2, you have to rank them because you can't rank 2 people at 10, right? But they're all very, very close to each other, and 2 good weeks from one of them could catapult them up a little bit, but the movement between them shouldn't be noteworthy as far as oh my goodness, there are such better plays now. And no, any movement in there should be viewed as relatively minor, but they moved up just because the Bengals are now throwing the ball more. It seems very clear that to start the season, they wanted to keep Burrow healthy. They wanted him to get game ready. He missed so much time. He didn't get to play a whole lot, obviously, of actual game action before week 1. And so they didn't want to throw him out there and have him attempt 50 passes, right? Especially with how poorly they played in the preseason. And so it's not shocking that to start the year, they were a little bit more run heavy. Now they're going more pass heavy. Well, that's going to be good for a very consolidated target share for the receivers, and it's going to be very good for their alpha. And we're going to talk about T. Higgins later on. It's very good for him as well. And then going just to A.J. Brown, now that he's not poisoned by Chipotle, he's finally that wasn't the reason he was underperforming. He was injured to start the season, but he's finally over that. You've got Julio Jones hurt, you've got Derrick Henry hurt, and you've got absolute trash behind him on the depth chart. He's going to have a 35% target share. He'll have games where he's at 50% target share, an insane share of the air yards, insane share of the touchdowns. He's a stud. He's a mid-range wide receiver 1 who's probably going to have a lot of games moving forward of even higher than that. When it's all said and done, he could end up from this point on, if he was the number 1 wide receiver in the NFL, would you be shocked? Maybe, because you'd be oh, what happened to Cooper Kupp, right? Vontae Adams, right? There are still players you need to rank ahead of him. But after those 2, if you wanted to rank A.J. Brown inside the top 5 rest of season, I'm not about to say no to that. right? He's incredibly valuable because he's going to have such a massive share of the offense. And it's on a team that, while they haven't been playing phenomenally, they're in like the worst division in the NFL. So you know for the entire season, they're going to be out there trying to win games because, well, it's not that hard to make the playoffs if you're in the AFC South. Beyond these two, we've got Marquise Brown up a lot, 7 spots from the wide receiver 21 to the wide receiver 14. It might surprise some of you because, Bateman's coming back now. And it's like, oh, well, isn't Bateman going to take some of the targets? Even in their game before their bye this last week, we saw Bateman play 63% of the snaps. He got 6 targets, he had 80 yards. That's like pretty solid production from him. Brown still had 14 targets for 321 air yards. It was the most of the week by a mile, by like 140, 150 around there. And it was the most by any player all season. He is still their premier deep threat. And while they're not a pass-first offense, look at their running back situation. They might be a little bit more pass-heavy moving forward than we've seen in the past because the running backs aren't all that great. But regardless, he's clearly the one. He's used in the red zone. He's used deep downfield, and he's getting consistent targets. We thought, was going to be a breakout last season because of all these reasons, because he was clearly the best receiver, and he was great in fantasy. His targets are super valuable. It didn't hit because they weren't using him as well downfield. They're just like better at scheming him looks downfield this season, and the total targets were less. He was getting some of these looks, but if you're only getting like 5, 6, 7 targets, that's not as great as spiking for 14. That was like never happening last season. It's happening now. And so if you wanted to rank Marquise Brown as a wide receiver 1 rest of the season, I'm not going to stop you. I have him at 14. But like I said, the whole 7 through 15 range is very, very close to each other. So there's a lot of wiggle room amongst those players. Michael Pittman Jr. also having a breakout season. He's up 8 spots to wide receiver 23. He has been going off recently. And 2 games ago, remember that game against, I believe, the 49ers? It was like a monsoon. His stat line is like good in that game, but it's not phenomenal. But he drew like 5 defensive pass interferences like towards the end zone, like 30, 40, 50 yards downfield. He could have gone off in that game as well. Very easily, they're number 1. I'm very excited that this is happening because among the top like 35 receivers in the draft rank, because I believe by a mile he was like our most above ADP. We had him 18 spots above ADP, listed as a target and fire, obviously. So I'm pretty sure a lot of you have him, and I don't imagine many of you dropped him because like to start the season, he wasn't going off, but he was still getting looks. He was still being used really well. And so I'm very excited that this is actually happening because it like everything screams towards him being a breakout. The only thing that was in his way was Carson Wentz. And as we talked about to start this video, Carson Wentz is not a great NFL quarterback, but he's going to get it done in fantasy for us. And that's why we like targeting this offense, is because even if Carson Wentz makes mistakes, well, it's Carson Wentz throwing a weird pick 6. Like, you remember the other play that was dumb for Carson Wentz? He's like in his end zone and he just like throws the ball forward a little bit, and then all of a sudden they have a pick 6, and now they go from having like a game-winning drive to, we're down 7, we have to throw the ball. Those are things that are good for Michael Pittman Jr. because it creates more game flows where they have to throw the ball and have to feature Pittman late. And so just saying that Carson Wentz is a good NFL quarterback isn't enough to say you don't like Pittman. Pittman's going to be a stud the rest of the way through. T. Higgins, again, we already talked about this, though, up 8 spots to wide receiver 24. He is a like low-end wide receiver, too. Maybe the volume won't be there as much as we'd like because of, J.Chase being amazing. But with this increase in pass volume, because they're more confident in the knee now for Burrow, that's going to benefit T. Higgins. Had to move him up. Also, I've moved Michael Thomas up 6 spots to wide receiver 30. Way back, I talked about how I had tanked him in like the overall rankings, right? Like this draft season, I don't know if he was at like 50, 55, just because it was going to be a long time before you had him. But every single week, he moves up and up and up. This is one that's similar to Herbert. A lot of variance to it. I mean, if you told me that Michael Thomas returns soon and he's a wide receiver 1 once he returns, I wouldn't be shocked. But if you also told me Michael Thomas misses another 2 months and that he was never really the same this season, never really someone we were starting, I would also believe that. So understand that. While he's going to keep moving up and he's at 30 now, I don't know how much higher he can really go up before he actually returns and looks good. but there's a lot of variance. He could be someone you never use. He could be someone that to close a season is the reason you're having a championship run. If you need to spice up your roster, you need that sort of upside, maybe he's worth trading for. But I just want to point that out because there's a lot of risk and you don't know exactly what he's going to be this season. The last riser we'll go over today is Jerry Jeudy. I was very encouraged with his 72% snap share this week. I really did think it was closer to like 50%. He clearly isn't 100%. We knew that going into the week, right? Like he practices, but then it was really sore, his ankle, and like this is his first game back, first week kind of like really practicing, and so I genuinely thought he was going to be closer to like 50% of the snaps and just look okay. He looked fine in like 72% of the snaps. Obviously, it wasn't 100%. I think he's going to be 100% very, very soon. So I moved him up 11 spots to the wide receiver 37. Not ready to put him back where he was before the injury because I want to see him be 100% first. But once he is 100%, he's going to be good. And him playing 72% of the snaps this week is a very, very positive sign for anyone who was stashing him after the injury. Because I think within the next few weeks, he'll be right back to where he was before, which is in that like mid-20s. So those are the biggest risers in the rest of the season rankings for the last 2 weeks. Remember, you can see my complete rest of the season rankings, which again have been updated to also be a trade calculator on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Now, my friends, is the end of this one. Hope you all enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.